Hello everyone, Snickety here. I actually don't have a nostalgic preamble for this one. RPG Maker horror games are something I only recently took an interest in. Truth be told, I've always been a bit skeptical that these cheap, pixelated looking things were capable of capturing horror in the same way as a lot of other games. Admittedly, I've been a bit of an elitist when it comes to horror games. I've been thoroughly spoiled by what can be considered the golden age of survival horror from the 6th generation of consoles. There was a sense of artistic integrity with a lot of these works that seemingly died with the PS2. We went from subtle horror with deeply introspective and intimate stories, to just cheap jump scares designed specifically for streamers to performatively fly out of their chairs to. Is that Silent Hill 2 music in the background? Oh my god, turn that off, that's way overused in videos. Needless to say, I was pretty disillusioned by the state of the genre in the 2010s. Little did I know though, those kinds of games hadn't vanished, they'd just taken on another form. As limited as our resources were, it was the Japanese indie developers that took up the mantle, using a piece of software that wasn't even designed for horror in the first place. After playing more of them than I care to admit, I've come to the conclusion that I was sorely mistaken. These were the true successors to the golden age of survival horror. It wasn't your Slenders, your FNAFs, or whatever else came into prominence around this time. In this video, I'm going to be taking a look at a dozen or so games that caught my eye. I'd say a lot of them have historical or artistic significance to the genre, but some of them I pick simply because they're lesser known gems that don't get nearly as much attention as they should. I also wanted to keep it to games that are mainly focused on the horror. Omori is a game that's often lumped into this genre, but there's very little actual horror content in it outside of a few memorable parts. For the most part, it's a traditional turn-based RPG, albeit a very good one that I would recommend, by the way. The Fear and Hunger series is a bit more debatable since the entire game has this constant feeling of anxiety and dread, but I would say this classifies more as a dungeon crawler. Dungeon crawlers are not horror games, no matter how ball-bustingly difficult they become. Sorry, Tom Hewlett. I've never actually used RPG Maker myself. I got a couple of them on Steam for free at one point, but they remain uninstalled. Still, I now feel spiritually connected to it by virtue of having to deal with its jank, and seeing some of its pre-made assets show up in the majority of these. Anyway, let's begin. You can't exactly talk about RPG Maker horror games without getting into the series that pioneered it. The original Corpse Party was contemporary with the first Resident Evil and undoubtedly holds a very special place in the genre as a whole. It was created by Makoto Kadoin in 1996 using one of the earliest editions of the RPG Maker software, RPG Sukaru Dante 98. The version you're going to be seeing throughout much of this segment is actually of the fan-made remake from 2011, Corpse Party Rebuilt. The reason for this is simply it's the only version of the original Corpse Party that's been translated into English. However, neither of these are the Corpse Party that you're probably more familiar with. The one that can easily be found on most modern platforms and spawned a bunch of sequels and tie-in material. That would be the official remake from 2008 by the original developer, which was originally released episodically under the title Corpse Party Blood Covered. The subtitle was dropped from later versions, like the console ports that add in new artwork and scenarios, leading to a bit of confusion on where to start this series. If you want my opinion, I say you can't go wrong with the 2016 Steam version of Blood Covered. The newer version has all this junk around the screen for some reason. It's kind of immersion breaking to have the inventory on screen at all times. The more professional artwork and voice acting also loses some of that soulful Dojin flavour. But that's just me. Let's get back to the original Corpse Party though. This established pretty much everything that would come to define the horror RPG Maker subgenre. The turn-based battle mechanics that the engine was designed for are disabled entirely, with one exception. More on that later. Instead, it's purely about exploring the environment and solving puzzles, with enemy encounters being limited to what you can see on the screen. And even those are extremely sparse. Corpse Party doesn't try and scare you by bringing you face to face with supernatural entities though. After all, it's difficult to really scare the player with cartoony, pixelated sprites. especially ones made on an indie budget like this. The game therefore allows much of the terror to be conjured in your imagination. It makes you stew in the dire circumstances the characters have found themselves in. While staying after hours at their school, a group of teenagers are transported to another dimension. It's a sort of purgatory where the souls of the dead are tortured for all of eternity. There's notes left by survivors that act as a reminder of how hopeless the situation is. Anything can happen, and anyone can die. It's all about pointing to the unfortunate souls that came before you and suggesting that you're next. My favourite use of this is when you walk into this small corridor and the way in is sealed behind you. Inspecting it reveals that someone had been clawing at it to escape. At the other end of this corridor is a note that simply reads, "You can never leave." It's this brand of suggestive horror that Corpse Party excels at. You switch between two different parties as you explore the school, kind of like the last dungeon in Final Fantasy VI. You can permanently lose party members depending on the choices you make. This is a mechanic that didn't make it over the blood cupboard, understandably. That version is much longer and has much more going on in terms of plot and characterization. The same story beats are still there, but it's all been greatly expanded upon to flesh it out into a full game, rather than a short 2 to 3 hour experience. I'd say it's definitely the superior version of Corpse Party. Although there is still quite a bit of charm to the original simplicity. It also has something Blood Covered doesn't, an actual final boss. You choose 3 of the 5 party members for a turn-based showdown against the evil spirit that brought you here. This is followed by a final dash to escape before you become trapped in that otherworldly school forever. I'm quite the fan of this particular subgenre of Japanese horror. There's something so appealing about transforming a school into a labyrinthine, haunted death trap. It's always kind of surprised me that it's a uniquely Japanese setting as well. Japan has a very different relationship to school and a lot of other cultures, as I'm sure you're already aware, but the brand of horror that a school evokes is universal. I remember that the school I went to was this massive Victorian-era building that had a slightly creepy vibe to it, particularly on the rare occasions where I would walk its long, quiet corridors on my own. And that was during the day when there was still a couple hundred people in the building. I could just imagine how this unease would be intensified if I found myself there at night time. It's a place with a storied history spanning many generations. This is an idea that's always in the back of your subconscious, acting as fuel for your imagination to conjure all kinds of tall tales about who used to be there. This is, realistically, how locations end up having ghost stories attached to them. But what makes a school setting so special? Why does the supernatural show up here, of all places, so often in the collective unconscious? I believe the answer lies in the fact that they share a common denominator. They tap into an adolescent fear of a world beyond your control. The fear of failure, the fear of being bullied and ostracized by your peers. All of these things manifest as murderous phantoms. The school of Corpse Party is the school as it appears in your nightmares. Bigger and more terrifying than it ever actually was in reality, and more importantly, inescapable. Misao, developed by Sen and released in 2011, is another game that takes this approach. Actually, its plot is very similar to Corpse Party. A bunch of school kids are pulled into another dimension by the restless spirit of a girl they tormented. I'd say its writing is a bit more one-note though. While Corpse Party was happy to let our imaginations fill in some of the grisly details, Misao is right up in your face with it. The objective is to find all of Misao's body parts that are hidden throughout the school so that her anger can be quelled. Even though it deals with some pretty heavy subject matters, especially towards the end, for the most part it's just a fun, spooky haunted house. Most of the time its scares are absurd and clearly meant to be a joke. This is less of a traditional horror game and more of a trollish rage game in the guise of one. There are many, many traps that will instantly kill you. It's a bit annoying at first, but it isn't long until you realise that this is its main appeal. You quickly stop being scared of dying and start actively seeking it out, just to see all of the creative ways that your hapless main character can meet a gruesome end. This seems a bit counterintuitive to actually scaring the player. Is what I originally thought, but all of these random death traps do make the school feel extremely dangerous to explore. My absolute favourite one of these is the phone in the lab. It's such a boring way to die, and it may not have even had anything to do with the supernatural. I can't help but find it hilarious. But it's also the only one of these game overs that also conveys useful information, since this is how you're meant to knock out the Mandragora so you can steal its salt. This lab is the most out-of-place area in the entire game. There seems to be a chainsaw-wielding guy doing experiments here for reasons that never factor into the plot at all. Later versions make this place even more ridiculous by adding a laser that you need to turn off before entering. Now, my question is, was this place like this before Misao cursed the school, or...? And yes, there are a few different versions of this game to keep in mind, which is quite common with these, as you'll see throughout the video. The one you're seeing here is the original freeware version. It's significantly different from the definitive edition, which feels closer to a full-on remake than a standard remaster. The layout of the school is completely different with quite a few new rooms, such as the art room, computer room and cafeteria. It now feels much more like a real school. Although now it can be a bit more confusing to navigate since the arrows leading to different areas have been replaced with this subtle white glow. It's less intrusive for sure, but during 2 separate playthroughs it took me far too long to realise that these areas even existed. That could just be me being blind though. Because the school is now bigger, a lot of the puzzles have more roundabout solutions to them. You can no longer just grab the salt from the Mandragora, you have to take it to the grater in the kitchen, stuff like that. Then we have the more artistic changes to the game's direction. The scene with Kudo professing his love for Misao is now a bit less surreal since it no longer takes place in this random city environment. It now takes place in the gym, which makes more sense. I do miss the car that runs him over and smashes straight through to the bathroom though. The opening is much longer, instead of just dumping you straight into Onigawara's room after the school is shook up. Quite a big change is that you're no longer collecting Misao's body parts. You're instead picking up her personal belongings. This was most likely done to fix the rather glaring plot hole of why her killer would just leave her chopped up remains scattered across the school for anyone to find. Her body is now sensibly buried outside of the school. The flashbacks that show how this happened are now sprinkled throughout the game, rather than shown all at once near the end. I prefer this, as it allows us to get a bit of that characterization for the supporting cast before it's no longer relevant. This also makes it so that you're more likely to fall for the game's trap that will lead you to its bad ending. And you should, because it's the smartest plot twist that this game does. Definitive Edition is the superior version for sure, but not because of these reasons. The real reason is because it has a bunch of funny new death animations and game overs. Ironically though, Definitive Edition is no longer the Definitive Edition, as it was replaced by the 2024 HD Remaster, which is mostly the same but with improved graphics and redone sprite work. And yes, I did play through all 3 versions and become a Misao expert specifically for this part of the video. Anyway, while we're in this neck of the woods, we may as well discuss another game by the same creator, Mad Father. I should probably specify that neither of these games were made in RPG Maker. They actually used Wolf RPG Editor, which is a more advanced clone of RPG Maker from what I've read. They're pretty much the same thing from the perspective of anyone who isn't a programmer. You play as a little girl named Aya after her mansion becomes a hotbed of supernatural activity following her father's sadistic human experiments in the basement. Mad Father sort of has a similar structure to a Resident Evil game. You're initially running back and forth between the wings of the mansion looking for items to progress. The scares aren't all based around trolling the player with comical game overs this time around. Perhaps my biggest criticism with this genre is that they almost never know how to implement traditional survival horror game mechanics, so they all resort to making every enemy lethal to the touch. This game remedies this by actually giving you a health bar during most encounters. It fully replenishes whenever you leave the room though, meaning there's no long-term penalty for taking damage. Still a welcome addition. Much less welcome are the QTE segments that have you mashing the Z key. If this was your first horror game, I imagine it would be pretty effective, but to me it never goes beyond mild thrills. Nothing in it goes as hard or dark as I would have liked. Excuse the poor phrasing. It doesn't go full Junji Ito, it doesn't go full Kazuo Uematsu, not even a Hideshi Hino. It's just a tad lame, even when compared to Sen's previous work on Misao. It has a lot more going on in terms of story though. Aya is trying to save her father because, well, she loves him. But this is repeatedly put to the test as she's faced with the aftermath of his evil. Not all of the spirits in the mansion are mindless ghouls. Some of them are sympathetic figures that are willing to lend her a hand. This is the only interesting thing the story does, however. For the most part, it's quite shallow and doesn't spring any interesting plot twists on the player. Surprise, surprise, the titular mad father is quite mad and is absolutely out to murder you. But the real reason I'm not a fan of this game's story is the ending. Specifically, the true ending, where it's heavily implied that Aya follows in her father's crazy footsteps and starts murdering people too. This is such a baffling plot development because the entire story was going in the opposite direction. Towards the end, she promises to remember everyone who perished in the mansion, since no one else will. She's gained a respect for the sanctity of life after seeing how it was so thoroughly disregarded by her father, and she vows never to make the same mistake. Whatever meaning you might have gotten out of this is undone by this stupid ending. Then again, Sen never really does stick it on the landing. A problem that Misao also has with its epilogue campaign that tries to redeem a completely irredeemable character. I'm a bit mixed on Mad Father, but I can see why it has a cult following. The artwork is lovely, and it is a very well put together game. The 2010s was undoubtedly the golden age for these types of games. Most of the titles featured in this video, many of which are considered important classics of the genre, were released during this period. Let's take a step back for now though, and look at how we got here. Corpse Party would serve as a blueprint for most that came after, right down to even its blemishes. Even if these games don't use the RPG Maker mechanics built into RPG Maker, they almost never make any effort to hide them. You'll be able to see the health and magical points, even if health isn't a factor and magic has no place in its setting. There's a lot of superfluous menus and information like this that the player can view quite easily. Sometimes, instead of getting rid of it outright, presumably because they can, they do something clever with it. Devil in the Mirror has all of the numbers on the save screen set to 4, a number associated with death in a lot of East Asian countries. Not all of these horror games forsake the RPG genre entirely though, even if it is greatly de-emphasized. There are some that opt to blend the two genres together in a way that brings to mind Capcom's Sweet Home from 1989. The grandfather of all survival horror, really. One such example is Makoto Yaotani's Peret-em-Hru for the Prisoners, an absolutely bonkers game that must be seen to be believed. It might be the most eclectic game in this video. It's an Indiana Jonesian high adventure mixed with the kind of pulpy horror that you would find in the pages of Tales from the Crypt. A group of Japanese tourists are sent into a pyramid by an amoral professor seeking to unearth the tomb of Pharaoh King Khufu. He's pretty much just using them as guinea pigs to protect himself from all the booby traps within. It takes a page out of Corpse Party's book by having characters that can either live or die depending on your decisions. Anyone you don't save will show up towards the end as an undead boss fight, and any you do will become usable as a party member using the recruit command. Random encounters are infrequent and the battle system is very simple, to the point of being irrelevant most of the time. Well, until you get to the end game and have to fight these absurdly powerful geckos that are somehow harder than the final boss.
Eat my tail, Nancy boy.
The gameplay outside a battle consists of using menu commands to perform certain actions, usually while someone's life is on the line. This makes for a tense and thrilling playthrough, especially if you go in completely blind with the goal of saving everyone. The cast is mostly made up of archetypes, with stories that often go in interesting, unexpected directions, like the tour guide turning out to be a drug mule. I particularly like the self-destructive Sayori Shinoda, who went into the pyramid specifically to find a place to die. The most well fleshed out character though is Professor Tsuchida. He's introduced in the prologue before we even meet any of the main characters. This adds an extra dimension to him that the other characters are unaware of throughout much of the story. His concern for their safety is insincere, to say the least. He's a bit of a scumbag, only in it for his own ends, but his motives are more nuanced than they initially appear. This is one of the most aesthetically pleasing RPG Maker games ever made. It makes great use of the more limited colour palette of the PC-98 to produce these nice earthy tones. It does the job of conveying the Egyptian setting, something that probably wasn't easy in an engine created mostly for mimicking old-school fantasy RPGs. None of the games in this video are really using the software in the way it was originally intended, but I think that's one of the things that makes them so interesting artistically. It's taking this pre-existing framework and trying to make something new and interesting within its stringent limitations. These efforts have been going on for so long now that it pretty much has its own vocabulary. After playing just a few of these, you'll know exactly what you're in for. But this makes those rare titles that manage to stand out in spite of this all the more impressive. In 2000, there was Nishida Yoshitaka's Pallete, a cerebral journey through the fragmented memories of a woman who is trying to remember who she is. This is conveyed through the gameplay in a pretty clever way. You have to collect shreds of memory that will allow you to piece together blocked off parts of the map. You have a gauge that drains every time you move to a different memory. If it runs out, you'll be kicked back to the doctor's office and will have to start back from square one. It's pretty manageable at first since you don't have many options, but after a while it can become quite overwhelming. Finding a new clue will have you searching across all of these different maps for a way to progress. Unless you have a photographic memory, it devolves into exhausting every option until you find a path forward, which I found to be rather tiresome. Nevertheless, there's something incredibly captivating here that's hard not to admire. The first crime scene you inspect is particularly memorable. It has a soundtrack that makes it feel like a Michael Mann-esque thriller. Its narrative is confusing and builds up to a crazy plot twist ending that I don't think anyone would see coming, especially not back in the early 2000s freeware scene. Is it well told? That's debatable, but it is told with a unique voice. The telltale sign of someone putting RPG Maker to good use. It was extremely well received back when it was released, so much so that it was remade for the PSX. This edition has much better graphics than the original freeware version, but it never received an English translation, or any sort of release outside of Japan. It'd be remiss of me not to mention Kikiyama's Yume Nikki from 2004, a game that needs no introduction if you have even a passing familiarity with these types of games. It's not a horror game in the traditional sense. It doesn't feature any jump scares or overt horror imagery, nor does it seek to distress the player in any way. Rather, it's a moody, almost meditative experience that encourages introspection. The abstract way in which it conveys its story means that everyone will have their own interpretation of the game's themes and symbolism. It feels deeply personal and universal of the human condition all at the same time. The fact that we know almost nothing about its creator, aside from his Denny's order, helps preserve its overall mystique and enigmatic qualities. Yume Nikki truly was a shining example that RPG Maker could be used for more than just a humble dungeon crawler. It could be a great outlet of self-expression for any would-be outsider artists. Its influence can still be felt in many indie games to this day, and it pioneered its own kind of take on the RPG Maker horror game. Explorer horror, a subgenre that typically puts environmental storytelling at the forefront. These have you trekking through lonely places that are often detached, both literally and symbolically, from the real world. They may serve as a reflection of the protagonist's mental state as a metaphor for a broken or damaged psyche. Here, it's not the presence of evil creatures that is intended to unsettle you, but the absence of any life at all. This genre is like a warm blanket for the outcasts and downtrodden of the world. A beacon of light in the darkness that reminds them that they are not alone in their feelings. I don't think anything better exemplifies this than the work of Pert-em-Hru, one of the most talented auteurs who ever chose RPG Maker as his canvas. Kinder, specifically its 2010 remake, Rekinder, is raw, unfiltered self-expression in its purest, most visceral form. There's a lot here that you will simply never find in a mainstream work. It's as refreshing as it is stomach-churning in its graphic content and brutal honesty. The game begins with not one but two cynical juxtapositions. The question of if a storybook happy ending can occur in real life, and Shunsuke's tranquil, peaceful life being thrown into utter chaos. He and his friends are transported to a twisted version of their town infested by monsters, where they're forced to take part in a death game orchestrated by a young psychopath named Yuichi Mizuoka. None of them have ever even met him before. At first, it just seems like random sadism. He brought them here to show them the world as he sees it, a brutally unfair place where happy storybook endings do not exist. Those aforementioned juxtapositions can definitely be read as an expression of Yuichi's worldview. This is most likely what he believes his motives are too, which is why he acts the part of this overly theatrical villain that takes great delight in murder. He even quotes Jigsaw at one point, a line that was originally a reference to the Kobe child murders according to the translator. In other words, this is an adolescent's idea of a villain, hence the childish, flippant tone of much of his dialogue, and the game in general really. There's a lot of gold in here, it must be said. However, Yuichi is much more multifaceted than he initially appears. He's a result of a troubled home life that forced him to grow up far too early. He also seems to exist in a world where mental illness isn't recognised as a legitimate condition. It's referred to as mind illness and is treated like an excuse for laziness by doctors. This is an interesting detail for a number of reasons. On one hand, it can be read as a commentary by the creator about how mental illness is not taken seriously enough by society. You can also look at it another way. By treating it this way, as a foreign concept, it becomes just as strange and unfamiliar to us as it does this child, who absolutely should not have to be thinking about this at his age. The point is, it's something he can't explain, leaving him utterly ostracized and detached from everyone around him, including his own mother. Without that human connection, he can now only see the ugliness in people, the hypocrisy and lies of a broken society. Towards the end though, we learn that there's still a part of him that yearns for someone to understand him. This recontextualizes the entire conflict as Yuichi's last cry for help before taking his own life. That's why he brought everyone here. They're all, in some way, just as broken as he is. If anyone could understand him, it would be this group of friends. It's a story that's quite common in JRPGs. The eternal battle of hope versus nihilism, where friendship always triumphs over despair. The game rebukes the simplicity and emptiness of these kinds of platitudes, as does Yuichi himself. Even so, he's only human, so he awaits the arrival of a prince to give him that storybook ending. The homoerotic undertones implied by Yuichi casting himself as a princess and Shunsuke as a prince is definitely intentional. Pert-em-Hru's work often explored these themes, such as in the game that is arguably his magnum opus, Heisei Pistol Show. He wants his cynicism to finally be proven false. He wants that cliched happy ending that the world has been telling him exists out there somewhere. But he's already too far gone to expect any forgiveness, nor does he think he even deserves it at this point. The heroic prince that he was waiting for does not exist in real life. Even Shunsuke's seemingly selfless actions are revealed to have an ulterior motive in the game's epilogue. He felt that by saving Yuichi, he could perhaps save himself. He saw a bit of himself in him. Only by saving him can he refute his worldview and reassure himself that the world is not as bad as he said it was. People are not as selfless as they pretend to be. Even after such a nihilistic conclusion though, there's still a sliver of hope within its final lines. When I'm an adult, I hope to be a kinder one. This is a fantastic game with a tone unlike any other. It hits you with so many heavy and thought-provoking lines of dialogue. Perhaps its brand of horror is a little too real for some. It hits on societal angst in a way that you may or may not resonate with. But as I said earlier, those who do see parts of themselves represented in Yuichi will feel a strong connection to its themes and message. The rest of the characters aren't bad by any means, but they definitely get a lot less attention than Yuichi. Much like other games in the genre, they can die permanently depending on your decisions. Although you can't reach the entire last third of the story with any casualties. It'll just give you one of the bad endings. There are no random encounters, and your characters don't level up. Each battle is mainly a puzzle that you have to solve using the skills you've been given. There isn't much nuance to it. You either win how the game intended you to, or you just die. The only time the player has much customization is towards the end, when you get to choose which party members to bring with you into the final boss. Thematically, this boss is fantastic, but as a piece of gameplay, there's a lot to be desired. Beating the second phase legitimately is a tedious and frustrating endeavour. As if in acknowledgement of this, there's an item you can find that will just skip it. Much like Perun's other works, there's a heavy use of stock RPG Maker assets and music that was taken from elsewhere. There's a slapdash, ugly quality to the game at times, but it all somehow coalesces into something wonderfully avant-garde. Sadly, it would be Perun's final project before he passed away in 2011. May he rest in peace, and may his work continue to inspire others for years to come. Aooni, by no props, is a horror game that has absolutely no pretensions about it. It isn't here to tell some grand story steeped in symbolism. It certainly isn't an analogue for trauma or depression either. The setup is about as classic as you can get. A group of teenagers decide to explore an abandoned mansion that's said to be haunted and become trapped inside with the titular monster. The Blue Demon, some kind of being that will pursue you around the mansion as you try to solve puzzles to escape. His appearance is one of the things that really sells this game. So much of its identity hinges on this guy's silly-looking face, and it's definitely the main reason it went on to become a cult classic of the genre. He walks a fine line between silly and a genuinely menacing threat whose presence you come to dread. He's a pursuer type of enemy that will follow you from room to room until a certain amount of time has elapsed. You can also lose him by hiding in cupboards, provided he doesn't see you going in there. All of the rooms are massive and filled with a lot of empty space. No matter what version you play, it all feels very cheap and haphazardly thrown together. It does, however, give the game a low-budget charm that only strengthens its B-movie feel. It's very clever with its scares, and will occasionally use the fact that it's an RPG Maker game to great effect, like having the Aooni suddenly show up in your party, or when he appears behind a text box. There's also a heavy emphasis on solving nonsensical puzzles, like it's the Spencer Mansion or something. It's all very tedious and has you running around looking for any spaces on the map that you may have forgotten to mash spacebar on. This footage is from the second version of the game. Later versions, including the final one, would add even more convoluted puzzles into the mix to pad out its runtime. The game always concludes with a room filled with loads of different funny looking Aonis though. What are the lore implications of this? It seems to suggest that the Aooni is a being that was made in a lab or something, but they never go any deeper than that. Like I said, there really isn't much story to speak of. Dialogue with other characters is sparse and feels kind of empty, much like the environments. It's all pretty minimalist, even right down to the sound design. There's very little in the way of music outside of this one track that plays when you get chased by the Oni, which is quite an effective track by the way. It does some of the heavy lifting in making this guy actually scary. Outside of this though, the game isn't completely silent. There's this strange otherworldly ambience that permeates every area. It kind of makes it sound like there's a storm outside of the house, but not really. It doesn't really sound like anything. It subtly conveys that this house seems to exist in its own bubble cut off from the world as we know it. Or maybe I'm just reading too much into it, I don't know. If you played this in a vacuum, you might come away thinking it's pretty shitty. I think my appreciation for this game has increased as I've played more of what the genre has to offer in terms of scares. It's more effective than most precisely because it's able to make good use of that chaser type of enemy. Outside of some scripted sections, you just never know when the Aooni is going to show up, and it makes it so much more interesting. Considering how popular this game is, at least within this particular niche, you'd think there would be more like it, but there really isn't. It's just an Aooni sweep for whatever reason. By the way, while I was making this, the first real Aooni sequel was released. If you discount the phone game's weird 3D remake, the online game that had a crossover with Higurashi bizarrely enough, and whatever else I might be forgetting. The strange thing about this series is that it's always the same characters and plot, just in a different location haunted by the same blue guy. Which I kind of love, honestly. In this case, it's an abandoned hotel in Hot Springs, an onsen apparently. In other words, the last place you would expect to find cryptic locked door puzzles. The floating timeline has come so far that the cast is Zoomers now, and Mika seems to have become a YouTuber. Possibly one that uploads those shitty Urban Explorer ghost videos. The game design is a huge step up over the original in many ways. It reduces backtracking by closing off areas once you're done with them, so you never have to stray too far from puzzles to find the solution. It doesn't introduce anything too substantial either mechanically or in terms of story. It's pretty much just more of the same, but not in a way that makes it feel redundant or lacking in creativity. Seeing the bare-bones characterization and some of the dialogue from the first game be repeated here actually endeared me to it quite a bit. Takeshi hiding in lockers and being scared out of his mind wasn't too notable the first time around. But once you realise that's just kind of his thing, it becomes much more amusing. Monsters are scientifically impossible. It puts its own interesting spin on some of the moments from the first game. It has an art style that isn't just plagiarised from Junji Ito. The dog Oni is just a fantastic addition for its introduction cutscene alone. NPCs now have a practical use as they can help you move heavy objects. My biggest issue with this one is that the maps are a bit more cramped and designed in a way that makes hiding the best way to escape a pursuer, something that was a much rarer occurrence in the first game. Waiting around in a cupboard while the Oni searches the room for you is really tense the first few times, but after a while it just becomes boring. Still, it's a really great Aooni game, probably the best. I would be shocked if it wasn't, considering how many names there are in the credits. It must be big money in Aooni or something, because they made not one, but 2 live-action movies based on it. They're both awful, but still, Aooni sweep. Ib by Kaori is one of the most charming RPG Maker titles ever made. There's a humble brilliance to it that elevates it above a lot of the other horror adventure games of its ilk. It's about a little girl becoming lost inside of a creepy haunted art gallery that is itself inside of a painting. It takes full advantage of this premise to deliver some extremely creative scares and surreal imagery. In the hands of another creator though, this might have gone in a much more forgettable direction. I can easily see it leaning too heavily into abstract symbolism, becoming too self-absorbed at the expense of the poor sap who just wanted a coherent storyline. Instead, Ib grounds itself with an endearing set of characters that you can immediately identify with. When it comes to horror, you run the risk of hurting the atmosphere if you introduce too many capable allies into the mix. However, Ib undoubtedly benefits from the presence of Gary, one of the best boys in all of gaming. He assumes the role of a protective older brother type to the protagonist Ib, who is so young she can't even read all the words in the art gallery yet. The game's story shows, not tells. We get just enough trinkets of information about everyone to form a pretty vivid picture of who they are. Its highly expressive, almost Tim Burton-esque art style also does a great job at bringing them to life. The 2022 remake of the game redoes some of the artwork and unfortunately loses a bit of its appeal. It's missing the heavy shadows of the original freeware version. I think one of the most impressive things this game's story does though is portraying this very genuine friendship between a little girl and a complete stranger and not have it come across as creepy. It kinda feels like Kaori wanted this to have the timeless appeal of a children's horror novel. There's something along the lines of Neil Gaiman's Coraline, for example. I think my only complaint is that I wish it was just a bit longer. The main party of characters are only together for one area before splitting up. That's not to say any of them feel underdeveloped, but it would have been nice to see more of them. The puzzles also aren't its greatest strength. They're okay, but you're not likely to be amazed by any of them. I enjoyed this callback to the original Corpse Party, where you switch between two separated parties to solve puzzles. This is another rare example of an RPG Maker game that actually has a health system, and this time there's only a finite amount of it for the most part. It goes a long way to making a lot of its encounters not feel annoying or cheap, while also giving the impression that your mistakes have long-term consequences, which is always conducive to preserving a tense atmosphere. Ib is not just a fantastic game in the context of this video, but a fantastic game in general that is very easy to recommend. It never overstays its welcome and has plenty of replay value thanks to its many endings and secrets. This next game was released during the same year as Ib and cites it as one of its main inspirations. The Witch's House by Fumi is also fantastic and probably one of my favourites in this video. It is simply the most tonally perfect one of them all, featuring genuine scares and a story with unexpected depth that will chill you to the very bone. It's filled with a lot of cheap and ironic deaths in the same vein as Misao, only this time it serves a grander purpose to its narrative. It's all characterization for its sadistic antagonist, the witch Ellen, who we don't actually see much of throughout the game. Some of her backstory and motives are hinted at in the diaries you come across, but these are only a couple sentences at most. Less is more, as they say. No, instead it's her house that we've stumbled into that harries us in her place. It reflects her twisted and inhuman heart. There's a touch of cuteness to its aesthetics that is really brought out by its use of RPG Maker. At the very beginning, we get chased by a big angry teddy bear for chopping up its buddy with a knife. It's something from the mind of a child, which makes sense once you learn that Ellen is just a little girl. It's impossible for me to look at her and not just think of Hanyu. I think that may have been a big influence on her design. Then you add in the fact that it's about witches, and I think we can safely say that Fumi was a Ryukishi 7 head. Anyway, if I had to fault this game for anything, I think I would say it's a little too fond of the chaser. This is pretty self-explanatory really, and we've already seen it with the Aooni. It's when you get chased by an enemy that is also able to kill you instantly if it makes contact. I feel like I've been menaced by this exact stock teddy bear asset in at least 10 different games now. I'm not a big fan of chasers in general, but I do understand why they're necessary. You can't really have a horror game if there isn't an immediate threat to the player. However, they are inherently flawed simply because the movement in RPG Maker isn't nuanced enough to accommodate them. It's grid-based after all. The Witch's House is an exception, but a lot of the time you don't even have the luxury of diagonal movement. So any kind of gameplay that requires you to quickly navigate a space is fraught with annoyances. It's very easy to get stuck on stuff or miss where you want to go by a single tile. Things that don't happen in regular survival horror games. There was a free Steam game I played called Luna that was entirely based around this kind of gameplay, and was highly frustrating as a result. This is something that should be treated as a necessary evil, not a feature. Luckily, the Witch's House only has a single extended chase towards the end that's kind of annoying. You can flee through the front door to get the regular ending, or you can get the knife from this room to see the true ending. And believe me, you want to see the true ending. It is, no exaggeration, one of the best twist endings I think I've ever seen in a game. According to Fumi, the entire story was written around this ending, and you can definitely tell. I'm about to spoil it, so if you haven't played this game and plan to, please skip to the next section. If you get the regular ending, it's just a standard happily ever after where the girl, Viola, escapes from the house and is saved from the witch by her father. If you stopped playing here, you could continue on in blissful ignorance. Unfortunately, the truth is much, much crueler. Towards the end, you learn that Ellen's body was dying and that she was planning on stealing Viola's by making them switch bodies. The true ending reveals that this plan was successfully carried out right at the start of the game, before Viola even entered the house. You've been playing as Ellen all along as she toys with poor Viola, dangling hope in front of her only to snatch it away at the last second. She didn't even have to go in the house. There's a secret ending where Viola expires on her own if you wait around outside for an hour. It's all a cruel game to her. This recontextualizes the entire story on a second playthrough. All the signs were there. There's a story in the library about a hunter and his dog that are tasked with keeping watch of a rich man's cart in the woods. The hunter eventually decides to leave early and entrust the rest of the job to the dog, which he dutifully fulfills because he's a good boy. The rich man returns and relieves the dog with a silver coin to carry in his mouth back to his master. When the dog returns home, it's put to death by the hunter for stealing from the cart. Upon reading this story, devilish guffaws can be heard from a chair in the room. No good deed goes unpunished. This is the cynical worldview that Ellen has adopted to justify her evil against Viola. The story also foreshadows Viola, in Ellen's body, being shot and killed by a hunter, her own father. The villain wins. Viola is a character that we take the role of under the assumption that she's morally aligned with us. She's a lot like Eve with her blank expression that you can just project whatever you want onto. Because of this, her assumed characterization is based on the emotions felt by the player. She must be scared here because the player is scared. She must feel some remorse over sacrificing this frog to a monster because the player does. This trust between her and the player lasts right up until she speaks for the very first time in the game's final and cruelest trick. She was never aligned with us at all in more ways than one. The player's trust has been betrayed in the exact same way as Viola's. It's so brilliantly mean-spirited and expertly done, you just have to marvel at it. Your mouth agape in horror as the ending lingers on Ellen's, or rather Viola's, dead body. That awful feeling in the pit of your stomach is truly only something that can be accomplished in the horror genre. I'm quite a fan of RPG Maker games that opt for more subliminal terrors. It's these kinds of stories that I find has a longer staying power. The ones that leave you with a filthy feeling from the bottom of your soul. Dreaming Mary is a game that perfectly encapsulates this. You wake up in a pink room with a voice playing over the radio that belongs to the game's creator, Atcha.
Thanks again for your support, and I hope you're enjoying the dream.
She describes the dream that you are now in like it's a whimsical theme park ride. As long as you stay within the pink areas, she promises it to be a wonderful time where you get to play with your friends. These lovely animals that have you solving puzzles throughout the game. It's all very cutesy and saccharine, a pretty clear representation of girlish childhood innocence. However, there's this underlying corrupting force at work that alludes to something much more sinister. The first sign of this is with the character Boris, a sleazy-looking boar whose dialogue contains some very inappropriate-sounding innuendos. He describes this dream world in a similar way as the radio. It's a place made for her, a perfect place, but it comes across as less than sincere, like an adult humouring a child. The fact that he's guarding the door to the dream world suggests that he's really the one in control. The narrative of the dream seems to mirror Mary's real life. This place is a facsimile of the big, isolated mansion that Mary lives in, and all 4 of the storybook creatures she encounters are meant to represent its only residents. It's quite easy to figure out which is which too. The penguin in the library is the uncle who gives her books, the rabbit is the maid, and the fox is her tutor. This disturbingly leads us to conclude that Boris represents her father, hinting that he may be abusive and neglectful. He sort of just shoos us along to go play with the others until he's ready for us. After a while, he'll instruct Mary to collect 3 seeds so she can go deeper into the dream. To do this, you have to play one last game against the storybook creatures, only this time with one of your white lilies on the line if you fail. According to the radio voice, this flower is a symbol of purity. If you play this game to its worst ending, every single adult takes away one of her lilies. The fox in particular takes a gleeful, almost sadistic delight in this act. I think the implication is that all of the adults are complicit in Mary's abuse, even Uncle Gwendol to some extent, which is quite tragic considering how he seems to be the closest thing to an ally she has. He's the one who nudges you off the beaten path to search for the secret room that will take you to the good ending. If you don't find it before meeting with Boris for the first time, it becomes forever inaccessible. There's a mysterious voice that is also guiding you in this direction.
Wait, don't go there yet.
It belongs to Mary's mother, who passed away after falling too deeply into her dreams. This happens to Mary herself in some of the endings if she chooses to surrender a petal to Boris. His dialogue here is especially stomach-churning. The dream can be read as Mary's coping mechanism as she tries to process and understand this horrible trauma that she's been put through. She's too young to succinctly put it into words, so it manifests through the dream's narrative and symbolism. The nightmare world beyond the painting in her room is a more direct and on-the-nose expression of this. Her father appears once more here as a tall shadow figure that chases after her. If you don't give Boris your petal and instead pick up the keys from this area, you can at last escape from the dream to her actual bedroom. It's a dreary, depressing place with a locked door. Mary is able to open this with a key from her dream and finally escape from the horrors of her waking life. But even this good ending could just be another dream. A fanciful escape for a powerless little girl. It's a game that looks at the darker implications of someone who chooses to dream. It's a form of escapism that comes not by choice, but by necessity, and it cannot last forever. No matter what, the dream will eventually end, and Mary will be pulled into a nightmare. It's a hopelessly bleak tale, possibly even more so than Rekinder. It paints a grim picture of a victim of abuse that is forever at the mercy of their abuser. I'm in two minds about this. On one hand, it could be seen as a passive acceptance of a situation that is far from hopeless. But on the other, it's hard to deny that the reason it has such a raw emotional impact is precisely because of the uncertainty of its ending. And it's not like it's definitive either way. There's nothing stopping you from interpreting the happy ending as real if you really want to. In any case, I think Dreaming Mary greatly succeeds in unsettling the player. It is, perhaps, a lot better than it initially appears. The artwork is lovely, and the music is shockingly good at times. The song that plays over the credits, called Nightmarish, is hauntingly beautiful. This game was originally meant to be part of a series, but unfortunately its sequel, Blue Dreams, has been on indefinite hiatus for years now. It's a real shame.
Sunshine, sunlight, starlight, moonlight, starshine, moonlight, good night.
Hello is not me doing a second introduction to this video, it's the title of a really interesting short horror game, created by Tachi in 2013. The best way to describe it is that it's like the RPG Maker equivalent of PT. You kind of know what you're in for with a lot of these games, but this one stands out as a truly surreal experience that will have you wondering just what on earth you're playing. There are a lot of bad endings that you can get simply by interacting with objects in the room, and some of your actions persist across playthroughs. It's a story that's told in a fragmented fashion. We get small pieces of information that will eventually build up to a complete, if confusing, narrative. At first, it just seems like the main character, Kazuki, is being haunted by his dead girlfriend, Akari. But this is flipped on its head when the entire scenario is quite literally reversed. We're now playing as Akari in a mirrored version of the same room that's being haunted by her boyfriend. Can't say I've ever seen that before. It's an interesting twist, especially in the true ending when these two worlds collide. This game is particularly heavy on jump scares, except when these guys show up outside of the windows. There's not a musical sting or anything, it's a bizarre mix of silly and creepy that makes for a memorable, short experience. Earlier, when I was talking about Ebe, I said another creator might have taken a more vague, cryptic approach to its storytelling. That's not something we can only imagine though, because that game already exists. It's called Bevel's Painting, and it does indeed go all in on the abstract, weird symbolism. It's unclear who we're playing as, and where exactly this is taking place. You're unable to interact with any objects or talk with any of the NPCs. All you're able to do right now is bring up this window explaining the controls. There's no flavor text to speak of. There's nothing to ground us within this world. And I think this is definitely intentional, since there's plenty of flavor text inside of the painting world where much of the game takes place. Even these details aren't spoon-fed to you though. This game hides a lot of it using its own language called Bevelese, which is just a simple code that you can decipher by using this image from the game's files. Her name is Bevel, and she's a painter. Truly, we have cracked the mystery wide open. Truth be told, I could not be bothered deciphering every message that I came across, and thankfully you don't need to. The important stuff is given to you in English or Japanese, whatever language you're playing it in. Initially, the game is quite pleasant with its calming atmosphere and colourful palette. It evokes Alice in Wonderland a bit with how you meet these strange creatures that can be inferred to be creations of Bevel herself. This is the inside of her painting after all, so it's easy to interpret everything you come across as a reflection of her. The rooms sometimes mirror the ones we see in the real world, and those silent NPCs show up again as victims of this torture chamber. Perhaps it's not that these NPCs have nothing to say, maybe it's simply that Bevel herself is unable to communicate with them. She starts the game in a room on her own, away from the rest of her classmates. I think they're her classmates anyway. Is it possible that she holds a grudge against them? Is this Fantasyland inside of the painting an escape for her that ended up being corrupted by her inner demons? Speaking of inner demons, this seems to be the central conflict with the clone of Bevel that appears throughout. She just appears to be another spooky demon like any other at first, but ends up playing a pivotal role in several of the endings. The important ones aren't just glorified game overs anyway. You can kill her pretty early on, which locks you out of the more interesting parts of the plot. It's from her that we find out that the entire game is about Bevel running away from a painful past, the specifics of which elude me. I'm not a fan of this approach to storytelling in the moment. It's only later, when writing the scripts for these videos, that I start having fun trying to figure out what it all means. The story of Bevel's painting itself is a puzzle that you're meant to figure out in the same way as the puzzles within the game. As I said though, it fails to engage in the moment. When it all unravels, I was simply left scratching my head. As for the actual gameplay itself, it's not too bad, at least early on. There's a lot of alternate solutions to puzzles that will send you down different routes with a different set of endings. It's very clever. But then we get to the Black World, and the game, like so many others we've looked at, becomes about the chase.
Be careful! I sense death!
There's a Grim Reaper enemy that has you running around and hiding behind things. By this point, the calming atmosphere and interesting symbolism of Bevel's painting has been replaced with something much more generic. I was wondering what this Grim Reaper actually represents within the context of the story, and I came to the conclusion that the answer was probably too cliched to be worth it. Bevel's painting is no Ebe. I certainly wouldn't call it a classic, but it isn't without merit either. Devil in the Mirror by Tokiro Keiru is one that took me by surprise in how much I enjoyed it. It's aesthetically gorgeous, and right off the bat you're hit with some incredibly creepy bad endings that are just filled with intrigue. The premise seems to be based off of one of those silly midnight rituals with extremely specific rules that no one could have possibly discovered through experimentation. A lonely girl named Rose enters into a world inside of her mirror to have a wish granted, only to become trapped there by an evil mirror version of herself that wants to take her place. The world inside of the mirror is a twisted mockery of Rose herself. It has a funeral motif that reflects her obsession with death, specifically the way she was captivated by the beauty of a corpse in an open casket. This is revealed a couple different times, in a backstory that is just weird and specific enough to be very believable. I can absolutely imagine a kid being at a funeral and coming away with these kinds of morbid fascinations. Rose doesn't have long left to live. The mirror reflects the last moments of a fading life. It's everything she wants in death that she could not have in life. A beautiful graveyard sealed in time where she's no longer alone. It's left up to interpretation if this is all an accurate account of her character, or only a single facet that's been embellished by this malicious mirror entity. In either case, it acts as a sort of Jungian shadow that shows her these repressed darker thoughts and impulses. This concept could have been cheapened if we saw too much of the mirror devil, like if it appeared in one of those annoying chase sections. Fortunately, it only appears during these crusty FMV cutscenes. That's not a knock against the game, by the way. I genuinely think the heavy compression on these video files makes them better. Of all the RPG Maker games in this video, this one has refreshingly easy puzzles for those who just want to play these things for the story and mood, like me. They're so easy, you may not even see all of the creative game overs that can occur if you fail them. It's a pretty good one. I wish it was a tad longer so the supporting characters can be a bit more fleshed out. They're too basic, which is my only complaint with this one. Is it just a coincidence that Rose looks exactly like Viola from the Witch's House? Continuing with the mirror theme is Blank Dream, developed by Kanao. It follows a teenage girl named Michiru Usui, who threw herself into a lake and ended up in this strange realm of mirrors without her memories. We've seen a few games now that have this very intimate feel to them, like they're directed at a very specific kind of audience that would be receptive to its themes and just general sense of malaise. There's a sense of validation and comfort in seeing emotions you can't properly articulate being expressed in a piece of art. In the case of Blank Dream, it's a feeling that you might have experienced to some degree at least once in your life. It's the yearning of non-existence, the desire to have never been born. There's an atmosphere of misery and indifference to Michiru's memories. Even when it seems to be a happy memory, the music tells us otherwise. She cannot escape her loneliness and alienation even while in the presence of others. Her heart is tightly guarded by trust issues and an antisocial disposition. She can't understand why someone would want to be around her without expecting anything in return. Her life is not a melodramatic tragedy or anything like that, well, as far as she's aware, but it is one she's come to view as a mistake in need of correction. The mirror is the symbol of the self. It's a reminder of one's existence, so the act of breaking it is a rejection of that. The game goes a step beyond by having Michiru enter her own memories inside of the mirror and finding ways to end her life. The first is pretty simple. You just go into her inventory and use the knife. She's actually able to do that at any time, even outside of her memories. Wait, is this where Omori got that from? She doesn't always have the knife though, and will have to come up with new creative ways to off herself, like sticking tweezers into a plug socket or messing around with a fire extinguisher. It must be said, this is all incredibly comical given the subject matter, maybe unintentionally so. I'm not entirely sure how I feel about it. What's with all the oh, excuse me. Anyway, what was I saying? Oh yeah, what's with all the suicide in these games anyway? At any rate, everything about this game, from its atmosphere to its symbolism, is a reflection of Michiru's inner world. It's all a very effortless integration of story and game design. The Cracked Smile dinner party is one of my favourite parts. It shows how the struggle of always forcing a smile has brought Michiru to her breaking point. If you smile at the guests too many times, you'll get a game over. There's also another creepy haunted school that brings us full circle back to the start of the video. Blank Dream clearly takes a lot of influence from the Witch's House. It has some of the same comical game overs and trollish game design, sometimes to its own detriment. There's a lot of frustrating trial and error. You have like a second to react to this enemy when you leave this room, it's ridiculous. And do I even need to tell you that there are many chasers in this game? Obvious inspirations aside, there's a strong vision here that stops it from feeling too derivative. The story actually does develop into something more than just a teenage girl wallowing in her own depression. And there's a hopeful message for anyone who may find themselves identifying a little too closely with Michiro. Don't give up and continue on. Your place in the world and within people's memories is no mistake. That empty void you feel may one day be filled by something beautiful, even if it's something as simple as a genuine smile.
Do you have a problem with authority?
Okay, full disclosure, I'm friends with the developer of this one, but I wanted to include it just to have at least one game in here that I know absolutely no one watching this video has played, even the most hardcore of RPG Maker connoisseurs amongst you. It's by Lucid, the guy who did the Memories of Getting Head song in that one video.
Getting out of my bed, gonna get some hair.
Nepotism aside, this is still one of the most bonkers and esoteric RPG Maker games I've ever played. It feels like a bad trip through the darkest recesses of someone's unconscious. It truly feels endless and ever-changing. No two playthroughs will ever give you the same experience, almost like it's randomized. Or, at the risk of making it sound like a creepypasta, personalized. Psychic Shadows is a game that blurs the line between shitpost and pure and bridled artistic expression. Everything about it is designed to push you out of your comfort zone. It mesmerizes as much as it confounds. I could not imagine trying to write a walkthrough guide for this. The gameplay consists of walking around until you end up in another, completely different location, usually accompanied by a cutscene that feels disconnected from anything that came before or after. There are few enemies, but the ones you do encounter are the stuff of nightmares. You want to use bullets whenever you can, as most other things in the menu are either in Japanese or have cryptic names. When you start a new game, you're given the choice between light and heavy. This is not a difficulty select, but a route select. They both converge on the same place in the end, but how you get there is very different. Also, I believe the light route disables the menu, stopping you from saving, but that might have just been a glitch in my playthrough or something. There are areas that will just end up crashing the game, so it's a good idea to keep plenty of save slots.
I hope you like this.
Moreover, there are some areas that will also softlock the game, intentionally so. I would compare it to the original Silent Hill in that it's clearly going out of its way to mess with you. At one point, a timer pops up on screen out of nowhere. What is it even counting down to, and why? I was freaking out the closer it got to 0, and I kept progressing as quickly as I could in hopes that something I did would stop it. The anxiety was killing me. And then it reached 0, and nothing happened. It's a troll.
You must go and stop him. Go. Go forth, my Powerpuff men. Go, yes.
I think what's going on in the plot is that we're playing as someone named Victor who is part of the Echo Response Unit. Some kind of organization that hunts down demons or ghosts or something. The rest is a complete mystery to me, however. You meet up with these two chill dudes named Crow and Goat and go on a road trip at one point. This is one of my favourite scenes in the game. Dreamlike is a very apt way to describe it. It's a total vibe, honestly. You don't need me to tell you that it's a little rough around the edges, I think that much is self-evident. But it truly exemplifies everything I love about these RPG Maker games. It's like stumbling upon a weird and experimental indie album that unexpectedly crushes. It's a concentrated dose of artistic freedom right into the veins, but I think even that might be underselling it a bit. It's not artistic freedom, it's artistic anarchy. I admire its purity. Anyway, that's all the games we have time for now. As always, a special thank you to my channel members and patrons. I've been Snickety Slice, I'll see you around.